Okay, it looks to me like we're live. So we want to talk about um, Searle's Chinese room argument, and we are looking at sort of what he's got in the book, The Mind's Eye, and links will be in the description. So I'm not going to do a whole lot of citing. But so we don't get the abstract that we get in the original. So we just get the article and our reflections. So that's what we want to talk about. So I think the article starts with this little story. Hold on a second. Let me get about how one group of researchers have developed this computer program that was aimed to simulate the human ability to understand stories. Specifically, I think humans can answer questions about implications that are embedded in a story, but not explicitly stated in the story. So it starts with this computer program that seems to be able to allow the computer to do inferencing, is the way I see it. And Searle wants to explore these two conclusions and whether or not the conclusions follow from the fact that this computer really seems to be making inferences, right? At least in the case of one particular story. And so he wants to explore the idea that this computer can literally be said to understand the story and provide answers to questions about it, and that what the computer is doing explains the human ability to understand stories and answer questions about them. So he says that both of these two conclusions aren't supported by the fact that you have this computer that seems to be answering inferential questions about a story. And later he'll explain that what he says is missing, at least as far as I can tell, from the computer is this thing called intentionality, which I think roughly is sort of the capacity that I guess machines with brains have to direct their mental states at or about objects or states of affairs about the world. Go ahead. Did somebody want to say something?
I think there was an echo at one point. But I was just going to offer one particular distinction is that he's not talking about artifacts in general or talking about digital computers. He's talking about, he says it several times, digital computers as defined.
Right, we're going to get to that. We're going to get to that because what he means by what he says the strong AI proponent means by this this thing about brains sort of gets revealed in his little Chinese room talk, I think. Right, so he develops this thought experiment, right, and the premise is he wants you to imagine what it would be like if his mind actually worked on the principles that strong AI says minds work on. Right? So strong AI, strong artificial intelligence, or computational model of human cognition. Right? So that's what he wants to explore. So he postulates this Chinese room thought experiment, and I think it's through his explication of the thought experiment that we come to know the particulars of what he thinks is the theory of the mind being postulated by people he's calling proponents of strong AI. So here's his little thought experiment. Searle, who knows nothing about Chinese language, nothing about how to read it or write it or anything, doesn't know Chinese. Chinese looks like squiggles in text form. Is locked in a room, and he's given a big basket of Chinese symbols. And then, like maybe on index cards or maybe in a list or tiles or something. Then he's passed another big basket of squiggles with a rule book written in English on top. And the rule book is a list of instructions that's telling him a way or ways to correlate one set of squiggles in one basket with another set of squiggles or squaggles in the other basket. And then he's passed a third basket of squiggles with English rules on top, and those English rules tell him how to correlate sort of the squaggles in the third basket with the squiggles and squaggles in the first two baskets. And to pass back out of the room certain squiggles and squaggles in response to the squaggles that he gets in the third basket. So that's sort of the idea. And now he says, now unknown. Oh, and also, incidentally, people are given a story in English, or he gets passed a story in English, and he gets passed questions in English, and is told to write the answers about the stories and pass them back to. So what's coming out of the room are, as far as Searle's point of view, squiggles and squaggles on one page, I guess, and English answers to questions on the other page. And then he tries to sort of say, well, here's sort of how AI proponents are seeing this. So the people who are outside of the room, who are giving him all the symbols, they call the first basket of symbols a script, and the second basket a story, and the third basket questions. And they call the symbols that Searle's going to pass back in response to the squaggles in the third basket, answers to the questions. And then the sets of rules they give him are what are called the program. So he is now like a living, sort of embodied computer in that he's doing what computers really do when they run programs. So he says, imagine everybody gets so good at this that people, native English speakers and native Chinese speakers, look at the answers and they can't tell the difference. Both answers are equally good. It's just to them like whatever the room's doing, the room understands, or Searle understands, English and Chinese just like native speakers. Okay? So let's see. So from this, he then looks back at the two sort of conclusions. And he says, well, you know, it's obvious that Searle doesn't understand a word of Chinese. He doesn't understand the Chinese stories. He doesn't understand what he's manipulating or anything like that. He just has inputs and outputs, but nonetheless, he looks as though he's a native speaker. And so he's wondering, can that support? Well, he's trying to show that really does kind of show that you can't say that a programmed computer understands the stories, and trying to say that a computer program in some sense explains human understanding is also really misguided. So I think out of that we get an idea of the computational model of theory of mind. Hey, puppies. And I'm going to have to mute. But so let's just take it from there. You guys sort of correct me and help me out, and we'll sort of tease out what is exactly the computational theory of the mind, and you know, the software and the wetware and the hardware and the program, and we'll take it from there. I'm going to mute and let the puppies out.
Well, I guess I can try and start it off. So Searle is responding to proponents of strong artificial intelligence, and I think this was written in like 1980, I think. And for anybody who's interested, he's specifically referring to a paper by Schenck and Abelson in 1977. But they're claiming that the mind can be realized through an appropriately programmed computer, and in fact, that's all the mind is the realization of the operations of a computer, I guess. And so I guess Searle wants to impugn that notion by presenting what Helena talked about, of this idea that you are in a room given a set of rules, and these rules correspond to translating English instructions that you understand because you're an English speaker to Chinese symbols which you don't understand because you're not a native speaker of Chinese. And all he wants to do is show that if you're fed in a series of questions in the form of Chinese symbols, then given your instruction manual, you can convert those Chinese symbols into other Chinese symbols using the English instructions, and then you output these other symbols that are in Chinese. And so to someone outside of this room who is feeding in questions in Chinese and receiving answers in Chinese, it may seem like the person in this room is actually a native speaker of Chinese, that they can be said to understand the language. And Searle's pointing out that the person in this room actually has no understanding of Chinese at all, kind of by stipulation. So this idea that a computer can be said to understand a story simply because it receives a set of inputs and gives a certain set of outputs is misguided. There's more to understand than kind of this mapping between input and output, I guess. I don't know if that sets it up understandably or not.
Well, first, can I be heard?
Yep.
Before I guess we continue on with this, have we defined the distinction between strong versus weak AI to begin with, so we can be clear on just what Searle is attacking specifically?
Yeah, I guess we didn't say what weak AI was.
So
I think he was saying
he would
that.
constitute.
Oh,
He would
go ahead,
constitute
Bert.
weak. He would constitute weak AI as something that merely simulates processes that you have an actual consciousness, right?
So something
Yeah.
like Deep Blue, for example. We
Right,
don't
right.
take it Deep Blue is actually mined, but he can
Something
play chess.
that's
He can play.
right.
Right.
I'm so sorry, Hypatia.
Weak AI, the way he normally puts it, is the thesis that you can use computer simulations to simulate the mind and hence learn something about the mind, right? The simulations are descriptions of mental processes. And just as you can simulate rainstorms and digestion and economies, you can simulate mental processes. You can simulate events in the brain, you can simulate events in the mind, however you want to characterize these things. But you would not, by virtue of running a program, be instantiating or implementing a mind. You wouldn't be bringing a mind into existence by running a program. The strong AI thesis, by contrast, is precisely the view that intelligence, consciousness, intentionality, and other mental properties, other mental capacities are constituted of the implementation of formal rules and formal symbols in a program. That is, if you're running a system, it doesn't matter what the hardware is. It can be the wetware in your brain, or it could be silicon chips, it could be Intel chips. It doesn't matter what it is. It can be a von Neumann architecture or some other architecture. But the idea is that if you're running a physical system with the right program, then that system would have whatever mental properties it appears to be exhibiting, because that's all there is to having those mental states and properties, is the running of a program. And so this would be the ultimate in getting an intellectual grip on the mind, because we would be literally creating cognition when we write the right software with the right inputs and output functions and the right transformational rules. So that's strong AI. And I mean, he's not for anybody who might be thinking, well, does anyone really say this? Yes, this is actually a fairly common view. Someone like Herbert Simon at Carnegie Mellon said famously at the founding of the Cognitive Sciences Foundation in San Diego back, I think it was in the 80s. He said that intelligence and mental property consist entirely of formal symbol manipulations in a computer. And it's just that our computer is different from the kind of computers that we normally build, but it's the same kind of thing. So that's strong AI. And weak AI would be the view that, well, we wouldn't be actually bringing about cognition and mental states by running any kind of program, but we could use computer programs and computer architecture to simulate and hence better understand how the mind works, but we wouldn't actually be bringing about or realizing mental states.
Yeah, can I also, I don't know if this is too early to clarify this, but maybe not, because I think this is a common misconception, is that Searle is not arguing, as far as I can tell, for any exceptionalism. Like, it is he says that artifacts, he's not arguing that artifacts can't produce minds, or that the digital computers can't produce minds, but as defined, he's talking about a formal syntactic system does not have the wherewithal or the means by which to come by semantics, and given those inputs and outputs, that through a computer program of that kind, you can't produce a mind. And I think that's something that I think is misconstrued or misunderstood through these through the discussions I've been certainly involved in.
Yeah, can I speak a little bit to that actually? Because Searle is actually very clear on this, because this is something that a lot of his critics get wrong. He says, okay, let's ask an old philosopher's question. Could a machine think? He says, well, I mean, what's going on in between my ears right now is a meat machine, right? I mean, you know, this is a machine, and we think, therefore, trivially, of course, machines can think. We're machines, and we can think, therefore, yes, machines can think. So that's not the question he's trying to ask, and that's not the question he's trying to answer. That's not what he's investigating. Could a machine think? Yes, I mean, he thinks that brains cause minds. He's not arguing for some kind of soul. He's not trying to suggest that there's something non-physical or immaterial about the mind or anything like that. His view is, he calls it biological naturalism, and he says that the mind is about as abstract as digesting pizza. So he thinks there's going to be some kind of physical account of the mind in terms of neural events ultimately. But so it's not, the question is not, could a machine think? That's not the question that he's answering. He thinks the answer to that is trivially yes, of course a machine can think. So then the next question is, well, maybe the question is, could we build a machine that can think? Could an artifact think? And the answer to that is, again, trivially yes, of course. I mean, if you built a brain not out of silicon chips, right, but if you made it out of glial cells and neurons, and you know, just like our brains, if you duplicate the causes, right, that are going on in our brains, then presumably you could duplicate the effect. So once again, trivially, yes, of course we could build a machine that could think. And further, he says, we might even be able to do it with some kind of other architecture. It might not have to be made out of, you know, this carbon-based wetware between our ears. It could be realized in some other medium, maybe silicon-based or whatever, right? We don't know specifically what the physical substrate needs to be, what the principles are that are necessary and sufficient for cognition. It doesn't necessarily have to be the stuff between our ears. Perhaps, you know, it could be quite different, as it might be if there's an intelligent life on other worlds, for instance, right? We can be visited by aliens that have brains that look like coconut custard when we open it up inside, and you know, they might be thinking, and they might have a completely different neural architecture than our own. So then he says, well, you know, wait, you know, could a digital computer think? Well, even that's kind of a tricky question, because what he really wants to get at is this. A digital computer is not something built by IBM or Intel or anything like that. A digital computer is something that satisfies certain formal or mathematical conditions, namely the instantiation or realizing of a formal program. Right? That's what computers do. They manipulate formal symbols, right? It's a question of computational rules over formally defined elements. Okay, the formally defined elements are the squiggle squiggle signs, the squaggle squaggle signs in the Chinese room. They're the little symbols that he can't interpret, that he doesn't know what they mean in the Chinese room, in those bushel baskets. Okay, and the transformational rules, those are the rule books that are in English in the Chinese room. Okay, so he says, you know, could a system think by virtue of formal symbol manipulation? That's the question he's trying to answer, and that is what he thinks he can show is false through a formal argument and through this thought experiment of the Chinese room. Just imagine that you're locked in a room and you have bushel baskets full of symbols in Chinese. You don't speak Chinese. If you do speak Chinese, imagine it for another language. You know, imagine Finnish or some other language you don't speak. Imagine that there are all these symbols arrayed in front of you in these baskets, and you don't know what any of these symbols mean. You don't know the meaning of a single character. But you do have, in your own native language, a set of rule books that are very, very cleverly written by somebody that tell you, if someone hands you a squiggle squiggle sign on a piece of paper, take that squiggle squiggle sign, put it over here, find the squaggle squaggle sign over in that bushel basket over there, put it next to each other, rotate them this way, then once they're spread out this way, then go over to another basket and get this symbol, and all the rule books tell you to do is how to manipulate the symbols. Move this symbol next to that symbol. Once you have this string of symbols, replace that symbol with another symbol, and so forth. And then your last instruction would be, say, you know, take this last string of symbols that you've just put together and hand those outside the room to somebody. Now, what if, unbeknownst to you, the people outside the room who are handing symbols into you, slipping them under the door, they are lending an interpretation to those symbols, and those symbols are questions in Chinese. You have no idea that these are questions in Chinese. You're just implementing the transformational rules in the rule book and manipulating the symbols accordingly. You don't know why you're doing this. You don't know, maybe they're paying you, but you don't know what symbols you're translating. You don't know what any of these sentences are that you're handing back. You don't even know that they are sentences. For all you know, they're just filming you to do some kind of weird interpretive dance. And you're handing them back these symbols, and unbeknownst to you, they're going, wow, you know, Searle or Ozzy's in that room, or you're in that room, and he's answering all our questions perfectly in Chinese. His answers are indistinguishable from a native Chinese speaker. Oh my goodness, he's passed the Turing test. He speaks Chinese. And so if you go with a certain view that says that if a system, you know, walks like a duck, talks like a duck, then it's a duck. If the system sufficiently emulates intelligent behavior, then it's a mental capacity, then it's got that capacity, and it would just be a kind of chauvinism to deny that it has that capacity. And Searle's Chinese room is intended to show that there's something wrong with that intuition. You could easily imagine yourself in such a situation manipulating these symbols according to these transformational rules. Hence, you are doing the work of a computer. You're just a big, fat, slow, lumbering computer. You're the slowest, most inefficient computer in the world. Okay, but you are, in fact, passing the Turing test. And that's just to show that there's something wrong with the Turing test as he sees it, and there's something wrong with this view that would be sufficient for or constitutive of understanding Chinese. His point is, you wouldn't understand a thing, but it would look to everyone on the outside exactly as if you did understand Chinese, provided that the rule books that they crafted were ingenious enough that you could quite blindly and mechanically manipulate the symbols and pass the Turing test. So that's the question he's trying to answer, is not could a machine think, or could we build a machine that could think, but rather could a system have mental states, genuine mental states, solely by virtue of running the program? Would the running of the program by itself be sufficient for and constitutive of cognition? And that, he thinks, the answer is no.
Can I just riff a little bit off of that, going a little bit back to the coconut custard portion, in terms of, and I don't want to, if we want to move from what Ozzy just said, just let me know, but this is somewhat germane or relevant to what he just said, was that Searle's, it just helps to understand that Searle is very much focused on causal accounting, and that minds are produced by brains by means of the relevant causes that meet some conditions of satisfaction to produce a mind. And so what Searle's point is that a mind is simply a description, or a way of describing the brain being in a certain state, or a certain state of facts that have the effect of bringing about a mind. He doesn't see the mind as a separate entity. And so his whole point is that the relevant causes would need to be present for any system to produce a mind. And then there would be no question that there would be a mind, because the mind is simply the description of the underlying causes being present and actualized. And so if you had this system that had all of the relevant, that was sufficient to bring about all the relevant causes to mimic a brain, that it would have a mind. And I think that's an important, he then gets into the Chinese room and talking about why he thinks that this syntactical system isn't sufficient for semantics, and he argues that way. But there's like an underlying point, or an underlying philosophy to all of his views. I find it like very consistent through his theory of perception and language and other things, is that he has a very causally related physicalist, like a physical realist, or physical naturalist. Is that what you called it, Ozzy, in terms of his
biological naturalism? Yeah.
Biological
naturalism. Yeah. So there's a very consistent way to the way that he thinks about things, and that's why I think people mistake him for being an exceptionalist, or saying that there's some special thing about it. All he's saying is that there are levels of description for these states, and that a mind is simply a level of description for all the relevant causes being sufficient, or the sufficient causes being present to bring about a mind. So that's why he says that if you actually actualize that, there would be no question that a mind would be present. It's not like you have to guess that there's some additional thing, because that is actually what it is to have a mind, is for a brain to be in a certain state and have those causes accounted for.
Yeah. He's actually got, I don't know if I might just like read a short excerpt from him where he says this pretty clearly. But he says, "I see no reason in principle why we couldn't give a machine the capacity to understand English or Chinese, since in an important sense our bodies with our brains are precisely such machines. But I do see very strong arguments for saying that we cannot give such a thing to a machine where the operation of the machine is defined solely in terms of computational processes over formally defined elements. That is, where the operation of the machine is defined as an instantiation of a. It is not because I am the instantiation of a computer program that I am able to understand English and have other forms of intentionality. But as far as we know it, it is because I am a certain organism with a certain biological structure, and this structure, under certain conditions, is causally capable of producing perception, action, understanding, learning, and other intent." So, he's, I don't know.
Is Helen back? Did she want to guide where we want to go from here, or?
She got devoured by her dogs, I fear.
It sounds like they're on roller skates. Just imagine these dogs like all sprawled out all over the floor, or on marbles or something. Sorry, go ahead, TJ.
I'm here.
Oh, yeah.
No, go ahead, TJ. Well, the thing is that, so then he gets into, well, what exactly is it that's different, right? Like, what is it about me understanding English that's different from why I don't understand Chinese? And that thing is probably also what makes it so that computers don't understand anything, right? And that's when he gets into this business about intentionality. And to me, it seems like he's saying that that's sort of the main thing, although, at least in this little paper, right? I know he has a whole philosophy built around it with his biological naturalism. And there are questions about that I really got sidetracked by being interested in. But talk about how is this notion of intentionality one of the key things, if not the key things, as he explains in this paper, to explaining the difference.
Well, I think he just says, like Ozzy put it, you know, computers as defined are purely tactical engines. They just operate off of formal rules and operate off of symbol manipulation. And he wants to say that that can never be sufficient to generate, in his term, semantics, where the system or the computer or whatever would actually understand what it is manipulating or what those manipulations convey. And to that extent, I think I don't know if we discussed the distinction between intrinsic versus derived intentionality. I'm not sure if you went through that, Ozzy or someone.
I could get into that. I mean, derived intentionality. Well, that sort of falls out of a discourse that Daniel Dennett and John Searle had following this. The two of them had some pretty vitriolic exchanges in print and face-to-face over all of this. Daniel Dennett sort of has a view that's, well, he's a functionalist, but it's rather sympathetic to strong AI, and he would deny Searle's contention that such a system as the Chinese room would lack mental properties. He would insist that, look, if you were actually in the Chinese room, and we actually wrote the rule books for the Chinese room such that you really could pass the Turing test, that system really would have intentionality. The semantics would be guaranteed. It's just that you would have to have someone running around speedily who could perform the calculations, implement the rules, the computational rules of the rule books in real time. It couldn't be ponderously slow and that sort of thing. So the idea is that it wouldn't just look as if it's intentional. It wouldn't be mere as if intentionality, and it wouldn't be the intentionality of a calculator, for instance. We sometimes say, well, my calculator knows how to do math because it never gets the wrong answers, right? My calculator is a flawless mathematician. Well, look, whatever intentionality, whatever understanding the calculator has, is strictly derived. It's parasitic upon us and what we imprint on the circuits and the interpretation that we give to the symbols. Whereas presumably in ourselves, no, it's not up for interpretation. What the mental contents are in my mind right now. It's not you interpreting my meanings. The mental contents in my head right now are intrinsic to me. They literally are. They are in a certain way self-authenticating, and they're not up for grabs. They don't require a third party to interpret them. Right? So they're not derived or parasitic upon the intentionality or the mind of another. But I mean, could we just say a little bit about what intentionality is? Because people are not going to know what intentionality is. Okay, intentionality doesn't.
Chatting about that in the side chat. So yeah.
Okay, yeah. Intentionality isn't. I mean, it sounds like it's about intentions, right? No, it's not about intentions. Intentionality is a term coined by a philosopher, Franz Brentano, and intentionality just refers to the mind's capacity to refer. Okay, it's sometimes called aboutness. Okay, the capacity for aboutness. You know, sitting here in Ontario, I can have thoughts about what's going on in England right now and the recent referendum that they've had. I can think about my hand. I can think about the hand of a person living in Australia. You know, I'm sitting here, but my thoughts can reach beyond my brain states. They can refer. Okay, so the fact that our minds can refer, that we can have thoughts that are about, the fact that I can utter sentences that are about something, right? This capacity for being about something, that's intentionality. Okay, and when you look at something, there's an object of your perception, right? When you think of something, there's an object of your thought. When you remember something, there's an object that you're remembering. Okay, this is what we call the intentional object. Okay, so there's the active. There's the mental act, and then there's the object of the mental act. So when you sense something, there's a perceptual object. There's an intentional object. There's a mental object. There's an object before your mind that your mind is apprehending. When you're thinking of something, when you're imagining something, when you're remembering something. So a lot of our mental states exhibit this capacity called intentionality. Some of our mental states don't. So for instance, you know, it's arguable whether pain it has an intentional object, right? Think about a feeling like generalized anxiety, where you can't, you know, associate your anxiety with anything. Okay, surely something is causing your anxiety, and you're having a feeling. But what is the object? What is your anxiety of or refer to? Well, it doesn't necessarily refer to. Sometimes your anxiety, you're anxious about something, and you understand what you're anxious about. You know what's making you anxious. But sometimes you just have this generalized feeling of anxiety, right? So that would be a mental state that lacks intentionality. So most of our mental states, presumably, involve intentionality. I can be curious about something. I can remember about something. I can perceive about something. I can think about something, imagine about something, desire about something, fear about something, regret about something. Every time there's an about, every time there's something that your mental state is about, that's the intentional object. That's the mind's capacity for intentionality. And what Searle is arguing in this article is that the implementation of a formal program would not explain, would leave completely unexplained, completely mysterious, how the system, how the guy in the Chinese room knows what any of the symbols are about. You could never figure out what those symbols refer to, right? You're not connected to the world in the right way. You're not doing any of the things that would generate the aboutness, the right aboutness. Your mind, whatever mental states you have when you're flipping through the rule books, you're thinking about the damn rules. You're not thinking about the sentences that you're actually allegedly reading, thinking about, and allegedly answering when you hand out those pieces of paper. The intentionality is missing. The relevant intentionality is missing. The intentionality of the person in the Chinese room, if it's a person in the Chinese room, is the intentionality of What am I doing? What are these symbols for? What do I do now? What does the next rule say to do? Oh, I need to do this, right? That's the intentionality that's going on in the Chinese room. Now, get the guy out of the room and automate the process. Put a robot in there or a machine, right? Or a set of different machines all doing this, and now there's no intentionality at all. They're not even enjoying the intentionality of following the rule books. They don't even know they're following the rules. They're just blind, dumb machines, right? They're no different than a catapult, right? I mean, a catapult isn't trying to do anything. A catapult is just following the laws of physics. And so a computer is just following the laws of physics, implementing the rules to which we have attached a meaning. So the intentionality of a chess-playing computer is entirely derived. The sense in which a chess-playing computer is trying to capture a queen and willing to sacrifice a pawn and aiming to get you into checkmate, that's all derived. That's all parasitic upon your intentionality that you map onto the system. You are interpreting these as moves. The system knows nothing about what you're doing. And it doesn't matter if you're simulating a mind playing chess or if you're simulating a mind speaking Chinese. There'd be no intentionality, no genuine intrinsic intentionality. There's only the derived as-if intentionality that we impose onto the system.
Okay.
It looks like Jack is trying to say something. Jack, are you trying to say something, or?
No.
No. Oh, okay. Okay.
I think he's just got a little echo. That's all.
It seems weird to me. I mean, when you explain it in terms of the symbols themselves, what you're saying makes perfect sense. But in other ways, when you try to imagine, it seems like you could program. It really seems like you could kind of program, at least in a kind of a closed way, a program that, okay, this is going to be about the story, and here, spit out these answers. There seems to me to be an element of, I hate to say free will, but it seems like what he's really trying to say is that the person can direct their intentionality sort of at will. They can direct their ability to be about something. Right? And that is what's missing. And then that, to me, gets into this problem of free will. Go ahead, Bert.
He has so he sees intentionality as, he talks about directions of fit. So he says that when you're perceiving something, when something's presented to you by the world, and the conditions of satisfaction are met such that you are actually perceiving it, that is a direction of fit of world to mind. It is impressed on you. Your mind, the intentionalistic quality of your mind, that the mind is all about intentionality, and you can't help but have beliefs formed from that. That's where you are forming. That's the mind's aboutness about the world. That you're perceiving these things, and they're being the direction of fit is from the world to the mind. But then you have thoughts about that. So
let me just ask you. Let me just clarify. And would he really say that when the world is coming at you, that's intentionality, or is that just sort of some kind of causal thing?
It's a presentation. Yeah. So it's a causal. He says that perception is intrinsically intentional. That it is the world is presenting. You're being presented states of affairs, and through your perception, you have an aboutness of the world that you're building, and you then have other things, like you have emotions, or you have thoughts about these things, or you identify certain things. There are other processes in the mind that then have a direction of fit of mind to world, and so that is the stuff that you bring from your mind back out. You project onto the state of affairs, such that you're holding a model that has a direction of fit out towards the world, but it's based on you have a direction of fit from perception to mind, where you're apprehending states of affairs. And then he would say, like something like an illusion, or if you thought you saw something, if the conditions of satisfaction weren't there such that it was actually there for you to see it, that you didn't see it, that actually that's intentionality going back out into the world. That's you taking baggage back out and imposing it on the state of affairs, and that's where you're mistaken, right? Or that's where you can have that's how you can think that you perceive something when in actuality you didn't. You didn't actually see anything. It's that that your mind has these other processes going that cause you to have a mistake. And so I think his view potentially with the biological naturalism is that the mind's aboutness is constantly going. You can't turn it off. That it is a persistent process of inputs and outputs that are going on, and that the syntactical system actually lacks those types of processes such that it could develop semantics essentially. I don't know if
I'm
somebody wants
not
to clean that
clear.
up.
I'm not clear on something you're saying. Are you saying that direction of fit is a property of intentionality, or that intentionality has a specific direction of
Yeah,
fit?
it has a direction of fit.
It
Either
has
world to mind or mind to world is how he
Oh,
articulates
yeah.
it.
Okay, yeah. Well, I think another way to think about that is maybe think of it as a normative notion, right? Intentionality is actually a normative state. Would
I
be
think
the
you would say
implication.
there's a normative quality to it. I think you would say
Yeah, because it seems like I think when dealing with intentional states, I think paradigmatically the examples that are cited in the literature, at least in Anglophone analytic philosophy, are beliefs and desires. So those states are both seem to be normative states, and they have opposite directions of fit, right? I mean,
Right.
we can think about intentional states as another term that's used for them sometimes is propositional attitudes. So the idea is that there's a content that's embedded in an intentional state, in the mental state, right, which is in a that clause, and that clause contains a proposition, right? And so then we have an attitude towards that proposition. We can have an attitude, say, of belief towards it, and we can have an attitude, say, of desire towards the proposition. So what's interesting about desires, right, is that I want the world to actually conform to my desires, whereas when I want a specific proposition to be true, I want the world to conform to that proposition, right? Whereas with a belief, which is a type of truth-aimed state, or maybe is the paradigmatic truth-aimed state, what I want is the proposition to represent the world correctly. So it's got the opposite direction of fit as a desire. And so you can see that as basically tantamount to a notion of normativity, because I take it that what is distinctive about norms is that they're a standard which one can be in accord with or one can be out of accord with, right? And so one of the things we can think about as being distinctive about intentional states as opposed to other types of mental states, such as mere sensations, right? People often cite, as Ozzy did, cite pain as an example of that, although I think there's a good argument to show that pain isn't actually a sensation, but we don't have to go into that. We could just use that for the sake of an example for now. So the idea would be that what's distinctive about an intentional state as distinct from a phenomenal state, a mere sensation, would be that it has this property of normativity, which is that we can be in accord with it or we can be out of accord with it in terms of our actions, right? I mean, the interesting thing about intentionality is I think one of the reasons why philosophers are so interested in it is because we appeal to intentional states to actually explain our behavior. We explain behavior, what's called actions, in the philosophy of action. We explain actions in terms of what beliefs and desires we hold, right? And so we can act in such a way that we're out of accord with our beliefs or out of accord with our desires. And that is, I think you can see in that there's a constitutively normative property to intentionality that makes it distinct from, say, mere phenomenal states where that issue doesn't arise. I don't really know exactly what Searle's views on that are, but I think that's a very big issue in philosophy of mind right now, is the normativity of intentionality.
I think before we go into the normativity of intentionality, just to bring it back to the actual article, I mean, it seems very simplistic now, and it's even hard for me to imagine someone wanting to insist against Searle that that just shuffling around symbols is the same as intentionality.
But that's still a widely held. It's still a widely held view in philosophy of mind that I think that semantics can be reduced to syntax.
So the argument, if I understand it, is he says it can't be, and the reason is that brains have this intentionality for one thing, right? But to me, again, what I was saying is, it seems like what he's really saying is important about that fact about brains is that they can be directed seemingly like by will at things, right? So that you couldn't ever use a program to get a computer to decide, right, at will to think about a particular thing as opposed to some other particular thing. And I don't think he explicitly says that anywhere in his article, but it seems to me that that is really what maybe is at the bottom here, because I could imagine programs where if you program the computer to be about something, it could spit out answers that were related to the thing.
Well, I disagree with you there. Well, first of all, Searle wouldn't deny that we could program a system that could, in principle, pass the Turing test. He doesn't have any objection to that. He thinks, yeah, that's just, you know, it's just really up to the ingenuity of programmers. I mean, sooner or later we're going to be able to do that, so that a system in real time can be indistinguishable from a native speaker of any given language. You know, and it's kind of interesting to think about what you'd have to do. You know, like, you know, if my laptop could do that, right? I mean, you'd have to dumb it down because I could distinguish between, you know, you, Helena, and my laptop if I, you know, because I could ask, you know, you, what's 18,963 divided by 7, and then what's the square root of that, and you wouldn't be able to tell me, right? But my laptop could tell me just like that, you know. Right. So you'd actually have to dumb it down, right? So it has nothing to do with you know, sort of, you know, oh, the computer will never be able to do this and that. I mean, Searle's argument is independent of the limitations of our programming prowess. We might become incredibly great programmers that can, in fact, build robots that move about and talk and behave in ways that are indistinguishable, right? But his point is that that will still leave the question open. Is there anything going on in there? Are the lights on in there? Does that thing think and feel, right? But it has nothing to do with free will, I think, because he would say, look, supposing that we didn't have any free will, we couldn't direct our thoughts at all. Okay, supposing that, you know, I could feel things. Okay, I could have experiences, I could have sensations, right? But I couldn't direct my thoughts. I couldn't write, you know, I couldn't formulate sentences or anything like that. I could remember things that happened to me. Perhaps, you know, I smell something and poof, a flood of memories hits me or something like that. Those would all be intentional states. Those are all states of intentionality. Those are all mental states that refer to or are about. I'm not directing them. They're passive. They hit me. Bang. Sensations just hit me. Memories sometimes just hit me, right? Emotions, just waves of emotion and feelings of attraction for a person or loathing for a person just wash over me, just hit me. I'm not necessarily directing them at all. We can imagine organisms that are purely passive in that way, that don't direct their behavior, right? I mean, such organisms presumably don't don't really exist, but let's say that they did, right? They would still have program a system to look, for all the world like it's feeling and remembering and whatever, and it might not be, but it would still be an open question. Is there anything going on in there? Is there anything that it's like to be that thing? Is it having any mental states, right? And so I don't think it has anything to do with intentionality and directing your actions and directing your thoughts, right? Intentionality is divorced from intentions. I mean, it's kind of funny, right? Because the word intentions, if I say, well, I intend to do something, well, intending to do something is just a form, one of many forms of intentionality. I can intend to do something, I can hope to do something, I can fear something, I can regret something, I can desire something, I can believe something, I can remember something, I can, and on and on. There's all these, as Jack was saying, propositional attitudes that you can hold towards a proposition. The cat is on the mat is the proposition. I can hope that the cat is on the mat, believe that the cat is on the mat, fear that the cat is on the mat, regret that the cat is on the mat, etc., etc., etc. And I can intend that the cat is on the mat. It might be my intention to put the cat on the mat. I can intend that the cat is on the mat, right? And so intending is just one form, right, of intentionality. But so for Searle, intentionality is just sort of the meat of what he means by semantics. I think when he says there's a difference between syntax and semantics. Computers are just syntactical engines. They just manipulate symbols. They don't know, they don't experience, they don't feel, they have no understanding of the meaning of the symbols. We lend that meaning. We lend an interpretation to what our computers do, right? We could lend a different interpretation if we cared to, right? But it has nothing to do with whether or not the system intends anything. Does that sort of convince you, or does that make sense to you?
Absolutely, yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So maybe it might be helpful to talk about how semantics. I don't think I quite covered that, but how semantics are formed, or how what Searle would say is lacking, because I think that's something that I think people have issue with.
Oh, sorry, I didn't realize I was muted. I just wanted to make a comment on what Ozzy said. I think there's a strong argument that can be given, very strong argument, that there couldn't actually be intentionality without agency, so that a purely passive being, a patient, right, that it could actually have contentful states. I personally accept the argument. So it may not be for Searle that that's a necessary link. I don't actually know a lot about his views on free will and so on, but I think it's not as though there aren't important philosophers of mind who would say that intentionality and agency, or what might be called free will, are actually indissolubly linked.
Yeah, I mean, I could be wrong about this. I haven't actually read anything by Searle specifically where he would uncouple them. It's even possible that he thinks that they are coupled, but my suspicion is that he thinks that they are different. I know that in his book Intentionality, he sort of distinguishes between sort of passive instances of passive intentionality, and then the more, the volitional ones that are tied to agency. But I've never heard him say or read him anywhere saying that that you could have intentional states divorced from agency entirely.
Well, I wasn't. I don't have. Yeah, I wasn't trying to make any kind of exegetical point about Searle, because I don't pretend to know a lot about Searle, but I just wanted to suggest that it's, that there is there are strong arguments out there in the literature that, in fact, those two concepts have a deep connection. That you can't really. That mean that, in fact, that you literally could not have a being that was merely passive, merely assailed by mental states, and say that being actually has representations at all.
Yeah. Well, I can think of evolutionary reasons why that would have to be the case.
Oh, well, that, I don't know about that. I don't know anything about that, but there's an argument, just a conceptual argument, to show that, I think there's a conceptual argument to show that, in fact, we wouldn't be able to make sense of a mere patient actually having contentful mental states.
Mm-hmm. But in any case, I don't think that's necessary to animate the point that Searle's trying to make in this article. That's the only point I was trying to make. So
yeah. No, I wasn't contending anything against that.
So Searle is saying that there's no way for the computer program to go from just mere symbols and manipulating symbols like by rules, or what he's calling syntax, to understanding what they mean, or what he's calling semantics. And I think that Dennett is trying to say, well, hold on. Yeah, there is, or there might be, or there could be. So does anyone want to talk about that? Because I wasn't exactly sure. It sounded to me like Dennett was sort of saying, well, forget strong AI. What if we did it this way? And I don't know how Searle would responded to Dennett. But Ozzy, it sounds like you've read all that. Maybe you can kind of talk about that.
I would, except that I missed the very beginning when you started talking. I was distracted by something in the room here, so I missed the very beginning when you started talking about that. What specifically between Dennett and Searle?
It's Dennett's system reply.
Yeah.
Oh, the systems reply. Okay.
Yeah, his particular systems reply, I couldn't really see it saying, no, you're okay with just syntax. It will turn into semantics on its own. It seemed to me like he was changing things around on Searle, and I'm not sure if I have the right view of that or not.
Well, yes and no, but I think Dennett is sort of, it's fair of Dennett to sort of change the thought experiment up, which is what he's doing. He's sort of changing the thought experiment, which is kind of cheating. But I think it's fair to change the thought experiment. That goes to this idea of this thought experiment as an intuition pump. Okay, the systems reply. Okay, when Searle published this article, it was published in a journal called the Journal of Behavioral and Brain Sciences, and that's kind of an interesting journal for anyone who's interested in it. It's a journal devoted to the behavioral and brain sciences. It's of interest to everybody in the cognitive sciences: psychologists, philosophers of mind, linguists, neurologists, biochemists, people who work in AI. And what's interesting about this journal is they take an article like Searle's Minds, Brains, and Program. They publish that, but before they publish it, they send it out to a bunch of people in various disciplines and ask them to review the article, and they publish simultaneously, along with the target article, all of those other papers. When Searle published Minds, Brains, and Programs, there were, I think, something like 30-odd articles addressing or commenting on it, but 27 of them were like highly critical and rebutting Searle's argument. And one of them was the systems reply. One of them was the systems reply was something like this: look, Searle, when you're in the Chinese room, okay, you're manipulating the symbols in Chinese. You don't know what the symbols mean. You know what the rules in the rule book say because they're in English. That's all fine. So you understand them. And then you're handing out these pieces of paper, and these are answers to the question. Of course, Searle, you, locked in the Chinese room, don't speak any Chinese and don't understand any Chinese. But that's because you're just the CPU. You're just the central processing unit. You're just the bit of machinery in the whole system that's implementing the program. Nobody ever said that the CPU understands anything. You're just the central processing unit. It's the whole system that understands Chinese, not you, right? Not the CPU. And that's all you are in this scenario, right? And so you're misrepresenting the strong AI view. The strong AI view is that the entire system understands what's going on. And Searle's reply to that was, wait a minute, let me get this straight. The room understands Chinese? You're telling me the room understands Chinese? And the answer was yes, the room understands Chinese. It's the whole system. The system understands it. And he was going, look, that doesn't make any sense. How the hell could there's no way that the rule could pick up the semantics, could figure out what the semantics of the symbol manipulation is, and not me. Right? And he says, and if you want, forget about that. Just get rid of the room. Put me out in a field and say, Searle, memorize the rule books. and then hand me the symbols in Chinese, and we'll hand you the Chinese symbols, and you'll look at them, and you'll remember the rules, and you go, okay, if I'm handed a squiggle sign, I take a squoggle sign from there, and I do this, and I perform these operations, and then I hand them back that, right? There, I've just eliminated the room. There's nothing that was in the room that isn't in me, and I still don't understand Chinese. Therefore, the system's reply is rebutted. So that was the system's reply, and that was Searle's answer to it. But Dennett's reply to that was, whoa, 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 not so fast there, buddy. You're telling me that if you could actually memorize the rules in the rule books, the computational rules, and you could memorize these computational elements, these formal symbols, okay, and you could actually in real time take these symbols, perform all of these calculations in your head in real time, lightning fast, and hand them back, and you're telling me you're confident that you wouldn't understand Chinese? You're sure you wouldn't understand Chinese if that happened? Right? And so this is the idea of a thought experiment as an intuition pump, right? I think it was Douglas Hofstadter, who was the co-author of the Mind's Eye, the anthology that we're reading from, who came up with the idea of an intuition pump, and Dennett has sort of used it a lot in papers since. That a thought experiment is always an intuition pump. Every thought experiment is an intuition pump, right? The idea is you imagine a situation and you just try to work out the deductive consequences or implications based on the scenario that you've imagined, and you can sometimes learn things. If nothing else, you'll learn what the implications are of of certain propositions and how they connect. And so he's saying, look, this thought experiment is an intuition pump. Searle has asked you to imagine that you are locked in this room and you're performing these operations, but this would be ponderously slow, right? And your mind would be preoccupied with the symbol manipulation, and of course, at that scale, yeah, where's the intentionality? Where's the mental content? I don't think this room, the system would have any mental states. But when you do the other thing, when you imagine Searle has to memorize the contents of the rule books, right? And he has to be able to implement these rule books in real time, instantaneously. I mean, literally non-consciously, right? He's going to be able to do this. You're going to tell me that when your brain is doing all of that, that's not your brain understanding Chinese? That's not so clear anymore. Why? Was because a thought experiment is kind of like a machine with lots of dials on it, and you can change the dials. And all we've done now is we've made the room smaller. We've changed that down, and we've cranked up the speed on that thought experiment so that you're doing all of this in real time now, lightning fast, in not in a ponderously slow way that you could imagine going through it, but now it's just happening, right there in the hardware in your brain, in the same way that walking and talking happens in your brain. You don't know how the hell you're walking and talking. I don't know how I'm going to finish this sentence, right? I mean, it's just happening in the hardware, right? Now, if all that were happening that way, now it's not so clear anymore. With with the intuition pump dialed up this way, that this thought experiment, in fact, implies necessarily that system, the system, Searle, don't understand Chinese. Maybe you will. Don't be so hasty, right? So that's sort of part of the system's reply. And another part of that has to do with, he says, look, Searle, I mean, I can run a thought experiment on your brain. I can imagine your brain, okay? I can say, look, let's look in your brain, right? Neuron firings here, neuron firings there. There's a synaptic cleft over here. There's chemical neurotransmitters. All of this stuff. I can describe everything that's going on in your brain at whatever degree of specificity and resolution as I like. Nowhere in there am I going to see any intentionality, right? I can just imagine that instead of, but yet your brain produces this intentionality. We all agree. Your brain produces these mental states, Searle, right? Yeah, Searle, yeah, we do. Okay. Well, now let's just imagine that I take your brain and I blow it up to the size of a city, okay? And every neuron is not tiny now. Every neuron is the size of like a watermelon, okay? And they're spaced further apart. And now you have to imagine that there's a guy in your brain, and his job is he's like the Flash. He has to zip around inside this massive city, with these watermelons floating around all over the place, and he has to move a chemical from one watermelon to another. He's got to do all of the work that's going on in your brain. He's got to simulate exactly, he's got to duplicate everything that's going on in your brain. But your brain is now the size of a city, and there's a little guy like the Flash, call him Searle's demons, zipping around inside of your brain doing all of this stuff. When you imagine that, would you think, well, would such a system have intentionality? Would a brain like that have intentionality? What if it took, you know, 1,000,000 years to answer a question, right? To carry out all of these neurotransmitter events. If the little demon, the little flash inside your brain had to run around and move chemicals from one watermelon to another watermelon to another watermelon, simulating what's going on in your brain. What do your intuitions tell you? Do your intuitions tell you, yeah, absolutely, yeah, that would produce intentionality? No. It's just, so you would say, well, look, it seems to me that using an intuition pump of this sort, I've just shown that your brain couldn't produce intentionality. Well, I got news for you. Your brain does produce intentionality. And maybe something on a Neumann architecture, a system made out of silicon chips that has the right formal rules encoded into it, and the right input-output functions, that might have intentionality too. Right? That too might be sufficient for semantics. And further, that might be all that's required for semantics. And if that's true, then strong AI holds, and so you have not refuted strong AI. So that's sort of how that goes.
I think I'm a little bit confused about Dennett's view, though. I don't pretend to understand Dennett. But I thought, well, I guess Quine had the view that the intentional vocabulary was actually irreducible to a dispositional vocabulary. And being a naturalist, since he didn't think that the intentional could be naturalized, he held to an eliminativist view about the intentional. And I take it that Dennett, who I think was Quine's student, followed Quine in thinking that the intentional vocabulary was indeed irreducible, but also that he rejected it, right? And so if I'm describing Dennett's view correctly there, that seems in tension, maybe I'm wrong about this, seems in tension with the idea that semantics amounts to syntax, right? Or that syntax is sufficient, or, you know, some version of syntax is sufficient to amount to semantics, because that would suggest that semantics is in fact reducible to syntax. So I don't know whether I'm misinterpreting Dennett there, or whether there's actually no contradiction or tension there, or whether that's actually a fissure in Dennett's position.
Well, Dennett's is a functionalist, right? He doesn't abide strictly by the computational theory of mind. But he's a teleofunctionalist. But he does think that if you have the right input-output functions, then you would have intentionality, because as he sees it, intentionality isn't... Okay, intentionality is kind of an illusion for him. He thinks there's no distinction to be made between derived or as-if intentionality and intrinsic intentionality. It's all intentionality is derived, or all intentionality is as if as he sees it, right? So he has a book, I recommend it actually. It's great, interesting, called The Intentional Stance, and he says, look, intentionality is nothing but a predictive strategy. Okay.
Yeah, he's an instrumentalist.
Right. Exactly. So there really is there isn't intentionality. Okay, so he's reducing something to teleal functions, or using a computational model here, but he's not reducing something that's really real in the sense that Searle thinks that intentionality is real.
But it seems like it would follow from that he'd have to be an instrumentalist about semantics, right?
Well, I think he is, yeah.
Well, but if he's an instrumentalist about semantics, it doesn't seem like semantics can be reducible on his view, right? Because he doesn't think the intentional is reducible, as I understand him.
Well, he doesn't think there's a fact of the matter about what your mental states are ultimately, right? I mean, he's
Yeah.
Quine there, right? There's no, I mean Searle scoffs at this, of course, and most people who are not familiar with this discourse are going to scoff at the idea that there's no
But
fact
then
of the matter.
that doesn't seem like a reductionist view, does it? It seems like an anti-realist view.
It is an anti-realist view, but I think he is an anti-realist. I don't think he is a reductionist. I mean, he's not like the churchland. He's not an unlimited materialist. He doesn't think that you can ultimately reduce these things, right?
Right.
Searle is the one who's ultimately the reductionist, who thinks that ultimately all of this can be reduced to some proper description of brain states, right? So, I mean, I don't want to get too far into
But he
Dennett, that's
doesn't
what we're
think
talking
the
about.
semantic can be reduced to the syntactic.
No, he can't. He doesn't think that and can't think that because ultimately there's always going to be more than one interpretation that you could land, right? There's going to be some irresolvable indeterminacy of mental content for
You're
Dennett.
just talking about the disjunction problem there, or just indeterminacy of
Just
translation?
indeterminacy of translation, but I mean indeterminacy of translation because there's ultimately no fact of the matter there at all. So indeterminacy of translation is sort of. Do we want to get into indeterminacy?
Well,
of translation?
indeterminacy of translation might not be taken to entail semantic indeterminacy, right? You could maybe
No, it doesn't
argue.
have to be. Yeah, you're right. No, it doesn't have
But
to be.
But I take it that both Quine and Dennett are actually semantic indeterminists.
Searle argues with Quine about that. He rejects.
No, Quine and Dennett.
Oh, Quine and Dennett. Yes. Yeah. Okay.
But I assume Searle is not. Searle is. Well, I'm sure he's not.
He's absolutely not. Yeah.
Yeah, he's a realist about semantics.
Quine, I think, actually has a saying about intentionality in word and object, something about, like, if you take Bertano's view on intentionality, there's sort of a disjunction there. Either it shows that, intentional language is indispensable and important to understanding how human behavior and whatnot functions, or you just see it as a sort of a baseless, vacuous, empty notion. And his stance, opposite Bertano's, was to take the second, that it doesn't do anything.
But doesn't he also think that it can be useful in like folk psychology and stuff like that?
Well, if you're getting into the Churchlands, I thought the whole point with the Churchlands was that folk psychology is just a really bad theory. But it's
Quine's
very
view.
helpful.
No, but what I mean is that, like, for Dennett, I think he thinks the intentional is useful, right? He takes an instrumentalist view. Is Quine saying that semantic notions or intentional vocabularies are useless?
Well, this is in connection with the analytic synthetic distinction talk that happened, I don't know how long ago, like a week or so ago. But in relation to synonymy, right? Quine rejects synonymy as being, a well-defined or useful notion. And then in Strawson and Grice's reply to Quine in defense of a dogma, they charge him with basically being an eliminativist about meaning. Because if you eliminate synonymy, you don't actually have a concept of meaning anymore. And then later in word and object, Quine antes up by agreeing with them and then just eliminating meaning as a robust notion altogether, just settling for a type of semantic behaviorism where, like Ozzy was talking about, there's no fact of the matter as to what your words mean.
Yeah, but you could have the view that there's no fact of the matter, which Dennett has, and still think that intentionality is useful, right, in an instrumentalist way. I'm just wondering whether Quine, thinks we should just abandon using beliefs and desires as a interpretive.
Well, isn't that sort of in connection with his naturalized epistemology, though? He wants to remove all of these sort of normative notions as
no, just, at bottom, at the most fundamental level of description, they have to be eliminated. Question is it actually useful, just instrumentally to actually operate day to day with, notions like beliefs and desires? Because that's presumably Dennett's view. I'm just wondering whether Quine would say, no, we really shouldn't do this. This is just going to get us into a mess.
Sure. Well, I'll just try to say one thing, and maybe we can wrap this tangent up, because I guess we should go back to the stuff about Searle. But I think there's maybe two questions to distinguish there. One is just sort of the everyday practical question as to whether or not that language use is practically useful, which is manifestly obvious that it is. Quine didn't stop, talking in terms of beliefs and desires and whatnot.
Yeah, so it doesn't seem like it would be entirely vacuous then, right? Because it seems like it would be instrumentally.
What he might say is that from sort of a systematized scientific perspective or whatever, that's a deeply, deeply misleading way of thinking about the world. And so ideally we'd eliminate it. So I think what he would
But
say.
Dennett might say that too.
Well, no, I mean, I think Dennett, well, he labels himself an instrumentalist, I suppose, I guess, and a limitivist strictly about intentionality, right?
Mm.
I mean, you could sort of see the relationship between intentionality and microphysics as a relationship between economics and microphysics. Like in the full physical picture of the world, we can, if we were like some type of Laplacian demon, we wouldn't have to deal with economics. We could just deal with microphysics, right?
Mm.
And you can imagine a physicist could accept that, but nobody would say that, well, that means economics is somehow a useless endeavor, right? I mean,
Yeah,
the
but
fact that the two...
but that would be I assume those people have a reductionist view of the.
Well, what I'm saying is that he could see intentionality as a sort of very useful fiction, ultimately, as a way of generating high-level predictions on a certain scale. So on a certain scale, intentionality is a very useful way of talking about things, but it's ultimately a type of fiction, but it's a very useful fiction nonetheless. I think what the Churchlands and others want to do is they want to say it's not even a useful fiction at bottom, that we should replace it with a different successor concept. But I think I think we've gone too far afield as to away from Searle and more towards these periphery issues.
Right. I was going to say, can we get back to like little men and brains? Oh, one of the things I wanted to ask. So, if I remember correctly, in the response that Dennett gives, or whoever it is, whichever one wrote it, or both of them, in this book, I think he says that they pose to Searle, a teeny tiny guy, not a great big city, but they shrink it down so that the person is tiny and is in the brain.
Oh, maybe so. Yeah, I might be misremembering that. Yeah.
Well, no, that's from another article, but hold on, because I want to get to. I was surprised by what I think Dennett said that Searle's answer was. So he says he posits for Searle this teeny tiny guy, right, who can run around and actually, correct neurotransmittings and firings that aren't working in the brain of somebody. And so that person is doing all this mechanical sort of, I guess you could say, akin to syntactical stuff. And the person is then able to continue to function. And would you say that person is no longer thinking? I mean, isn't that sort of like a Chinese room? And Searle says, no, in that case, yeah, there's intentionality going on.
Yeah, but that's because he thinks, now it's not entirely satisfactory, but he thinks that, look, in the case of us and our brains, we know that our brains are sufficient for the mental capacities that we enjoy. Okay, and so he thinks, okay, well, if something else were reproducing all of the relevant causal variables, and of course that's what's really at issue here, then it too would enjoy the same mental life as we enjoy. Just as soon as you sorry, Jack, was that an editorial cough there, or was that a?
No.
Oh, okay. I thought you were editorializing.
It's just a cough kind of.
I thought it was more like a scoff cough than a cough.
No.
Okay, it was a cough. So Searle thinks, look, if you imagine a brain writ large, or just a brain our size with a little man in size of Searle's demon zipping around like the Flash, doing all this, as long as it's doing all of the same work, whatever the relevant work is that's going on in our brains, then it too would be thinking. The idea is if similar causes produce similar effects. If you duplicate the causes, you duplicate the effects, right? And as long as that Searle's demon is running around doing all the same work as the chemical neurotransmitters are doing in my brain right now, then that little guy zipping around in there, in that brain, or in my brain, would be generating the intentionality and the mental contents and all the semantics and all the mental life that I enjoy. So I think that's why but I mean, I think that's a kind of
Well, this is why I said that it seemed to me like they kind of moved to the goalpost on Searle, right? Because I would, he acted like he was surprised that Searle would agree to that. But now you're not talking about this strong AI computational syntactic thing that has no way to get to semantics. Now you're talking about the biological system and just improving the biological system. So I don't see how it refutes sort of what Searle's going for.
Yeah, well, Searle's argument to that is, well, look, if you've got a brain just like mine, and you're imagining a little guy running around and that, tickling the neurons and causing them to fire instead of the way they normally would in my brain, then you're duplicating the same cause. You're going to duplicate the same effects. It doesn't matter if there's something slightly different. Searle's argument, sort of stated more formally, or counter-argument to that, was, look, why are you surprised that I answered, yeah, of course that brain would be thinking? There's no formal program that's relevant in the explanation of why that brain is thinking. The strong AI thesis is that it's the formal program. It's the instantiation of the program that causes the brain to think, to have mental contents, to enjoy semantics and intentionality, right? But in the Searle's demon example, where you imagine a little guy running around like the flash inside your brain, tickling. There's only one guy tickling the neurons. There's no formal program running there. You could describe it as if there's a program running, but that description of that as a program isn't actually causally relevant. It's irrelevant. And actually, this is an important point in Searle's argument. He says, look, any system can be described as if it's running a formal program, right? Is there a formal program running in my brain right now? Yes, of course there is. Look, here, this glass of beer, okay? Okay, just think of this glass, just the glass, okay? All right, this glass of beer is running a formal program. That is, it can be described, its behavior can be described as if it's running a program, okay? It has a very trivial program. The program is stay there. It's got a one-step program, okay? So anything can be described as if it's running a program, but the point is, when I say stay there, and the glass stays there, or if I move it over here and I say stay there, right, and the program is still running, the computer program is still running, I can think of this system as instantiating or realizing a formal program that says stay there. Is the program actually part of the explanation for why this glass is staying here in my hand? No, it's the physics that explains why it's sitting in my hand. The program is irrelevant, right? And so Searle's idea is this. Look, there is no doubt a program that could be written that describes everything going on in my brain. It could be describing the mental events. It could be a program written at the description of thoughts and feelings and emotions and intentions and desires and hopes and pains and tickles and itches and pride and shame and lust and disgust. Or it could be a program written at describing at the level of individual neurons firing in my brain, right? Or it could be a program written at the level of atoms, describing every atom, its position and location and movement in my brain, right? But that program is irrelevant to why my brain is thinking right now. It's the physics that's doing everything, right? The program is simply irrelevant, okay? The program isn't doing anything. It's the physics that's doing it, right? And so Searle says, look, a lot of people think, oh yeah, if we just program things sufficiently well, supposing you were to program my brain, you're going to simulate my brain in a computer, okay? You're going to take my brain, you're going to analyze it, you're going to scan it, you're going to map out every connection between every neuron, every synaptic cleft, everything, all of the excitatory states of the neurons and all the neurotransmitters, everything is going to have a description in that computer. It's going to be simulated. We're going to simulate everything that goes on in my brain perfectly, at whatever level of resolution you want. Then when you run the computer, is it thinking? And he says, okay, well, if your intuition is yeah, that's what would happen. It would be thinking, because it would be simulating everything going on in my brain. He says, well, look, what you're doing there is you're confusing simulation with duplication. Supposing I simulate the digestion of pizza that's going on in my guts, and I do that, okay, on a computer, okay? I simulate every chemical reaction that's going on in the digestion of pizza, okay? Can I then stuff a pizza into the computer and say, come on, digest? No, of course not. Simulation is not duplication. I could simulate huge rainstorms over the city of Montreal right now, okay? And not at some, meteorologist Mickey Mouse level, okay, of, big clouds and stuff like that. I could simulate individual raindrops, okay, yeah, if I wanted to, if I had enough computational power and enough programming time, okay. I could program a simulation of a rainstorm over Montreal on a computer. Now, I mean, individual raindrops are going to have a description in this model, in this computer, right? When I run the simulation, do I have to tell everybody, okay, now everybody in Montreal, you know, get your umbrellas, it's about to get wet, right? Searle says, well, no, of course not. Look, what goes on in a computer is just a model. It's just a description. To say that there's a program that describes my behavior is to simply say that you're just, all you're doing is writing out the formal shadow cast by the actual causal structure, right? A rainstorm over Montreal has a formal description. It's anything that is formally describable can be written in a program. There's a formal description, a formal shadow that's cast by the actual causal physics of a rainstorm, of digestion, and of your brain states. Any physical system, if it can be formally described, can be written out as if it's a program. I can write a program that describes not just the behavior of this glass, you know, stay there, but also its transparency and how it'll respond under certain physical pressures and how it'll contain a fluid or not. All of that can be written and described in a computer, but that's just a description. It is nothing but the formal shadow of the causal structure written out, okay? But it doesn't cause the actual physical events. And he says, and Searle says, look, your brain thinking is an actual biological phenomenon. Your brain thinking, you're believing, you're desiring, you're hoping, you're remembering, all those intentional states, all of that stuff, that is a physical event, right? He wants to turn Descartes on his head. He wants to say, look, you know, it's not I think, therefore I am, you know, I am a thinking being, right? He wants to, therefore I'm a thinking being. He wants to say, look, I am a thinking being, therefore I'm a physical being. It's the physics that is ultimately going to explain our mental life. And as Searle sees it, the strong AI thesis is actually dualism in a very strong form. It says the physics doesn't matter. You can run it on any old hardware or any old wetware, okay? An understanding of the causal principles of the mind is simply an understanding of the formal description. But Searle says there's nothing formal about the mind. The mind isn't a formality. It isn't the formal description of what's going on in our brains that causes our brains to think. It's what's going on in our brains. It's the physics. It's the neurochemistry of our brains that produces our mental life. And to go back to what Bert was saying earlier about levels of description, Searle understands the mind-body relation this way. And this is important because for Searle, he says, look, if you're going to reject the computational theory of mind, you owe us an account of the relationship of the mind to the brain, right? Because the nice thing about the computational theory of mind, what attracts people to the computational theory of mind, is that we understand the relationship between the hardware and the software. We understand that relationship. That's very, very well understood, right? And so if it turns out that, you know, mind is to software as brain is to hardware, well, great. Since we understand the relationship of software to hardware, and if the relationship of mind to brain is the same as software to hardware, we've understood the relationship. We've solved the mind-body problem. That would be great. But what Searle wants to suggest is that these people are actually dualists in a very strong form. What they're saying is that the physics of it doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. Okay. But as Searle sees it, the mind isn't some juice or substance or, you know, other property independent of what's going on in the brain. It's just the same. It's your brain state at a different level of description. Okay. And he says, let's look how this works for cars. Okay. There is a description of how my car engine runs at the level of spark plugs and gasoline and explosions in the carburetor and pistons moving and all that. That's all true. That's, I mean, the mechanic will say, yeah, that's how your car works, right? That's how an internal combustion engine works. But you can get a physicist in there who's going to, you know, tell you a different story at a much lower level of description. The same system at a lower level of description in terms of atoms and electrons and the rapid oxidization of hydrocarbon molecules and, you know, and all of this stuff, okay? These are not inconsistent or incompatible accounts of the car. There's no, you know, micro level, macro level dualism. How are we going to, you know, there's no problem there, right? It's just the car can be described at two different levels of description. There's the level of description at the level of gross car parts, and then there's a level of description in terms of the lower level physics, right? And Searle wants to suggest, and I'm not entirely satisfied with this analogy that he's putting forth, but his view is that what's going on in your brain is your brain isn't giving off thoughts. It's not secreting some juice or substance. Okay, it's not some other kind of stuff, and it's not giving off emergent properties. Okay, no. To say that there are beliefs and desires is simply to say that this is a higher level description of what's going on in the lower level plumbing in your brain. Right? And now there are problems with that, which maybe we want to get into. I don't know if we have time, but that's how he understands the relationship of the mind to the brain. He's not trying to make an exception for the mind. He's not trying to suggest that there's something eerie or spooky or non-physical or immaterial about the mind. Quite the contrary. He thinks, I am a thinking being, therefore I am a physical being. And the problem with strong AI, as he sees it, is that it tries to imagine that the mind is something formal and abstract. And he thinks it's about as formal and abstract as the digestion of pizza.
My first time speaking. I'm just curious, Ozzy, where do you fall on the spectrum? Where do you lean in this conversation?
On Searle's position or the mind-body problem in general?
Oh, the mind-body problem.
I subscribe to something called neutral monism. I think that our conception of the physical isn't adequate to characterize and fully naturalize all of our intentionalistic idioms. And so I'm not optimistic that we will ever reduce it, given our current state of understanding of physics. It's not that we just haven't, I don't think that it's just, we just don't know enough about the brain yet, which would be Searle's position. I think that the problem is deeper than that. I don't think that our present understanding of physics and physical reality is able to capture certain features of reality. Features such as intentionality, subjectivity, consciousness, rationality. These are the very things that allow us to pick out a phenomenon as a mental phenomenon. We've really essentially made no progress using our physicalistic ontology. That's not to say that we won't ever do it, but I think as we presently understand the physical, I'm not optimistic that with this present understanding we will ever be able to naturalize mental features like intentionality, consciousness, subjectivity, rationality, so-called free will, that sort of thing.
Wouldn't Searle argue that's the first person? He kind of takes the view that it's the first person experience of it. The nature of that experience makes it not. It seems like he concludes it's intractable, or it's not something we'll resolve, but then just concludes that it's physical. Says that we can't see the seeing, essentially. Can't have a third person perspective on the first person experience.
Yeah, I'm with him on that, actually. As he sees it, it's sort of an accident of the history of science and the history of ideas in the Western tradition that we think that a proper understanding of a phenomenon means that we understand it in terms of facts that are equally accessible to any competent observer. That means that is, we think that something is only a fact, and he thinks this is a kind of intellectual prejudice, that something is only a fact if it's something which can be described and adequately explained epistemologically from the third person, right, intersubjectively available, right? But what he wants to say, and what I would insist on is correct, is that there are certain facts that I think are irreducibly subjective. There are certain like my pain, my thought, like you're aware of my pain when you see me limping and wincing and stuff like that. But I'm aware of my pain in a way that you can't be. And you're aware of your pain in a way that I can't be. The relationship you bear to your pain is different from the relationship that I bear to your pain. Right? I have to infer that you're in pain. You don't have to infer that you're in pain, but you're in pain. And the same thing with any of your mental experiences, right? So this idea of that there's something that it's like to be you, that is an irreducibly first-person subjective. So according to Searle, there are certain features of the world, namely mental facts about our mental lives, that are irreducibly subjective. They have a first-person subjective character, a first-person subjective ontology. Okay, and they are by their very nature different. It's not because they're made of a different kind of stuff. It's just that there are certain facts that are only available as facts if you are the system. Only if you are Ozzy will you know. Will you be aware of certain facts going on inside of me? You have to be me to be aware of certain facts about me. Okay, and so he thinks that we have this tendency to want to deny consciousness as real. Consciousness is hard. We don't know how to assimilate it. We don't know how to reduce it to our third person objective physicalist ontology. And consequently, there's this tendency among some people to say, well, consciousness isn't real, intentionality isn't real, subjectivity isn't real, everything, this is all illusion. And as he sees it, this is a mistake. All of these mental features that I named, like intentionality, subjectivity, rationality, consciousness, these are the questions that were bothering us to begin with in the study of the mind. And you can't simply define them away. I mean, maybe they're illusory, maybe we're confused about that. But as he sees it, look, something can only be illusory to a subject, right? And so he thinks that these are ineliminable features of reality, facts about reality. But that doesn't mean they're inexplicable. They're just not necessarily explicable the way we would explain how a car works, because there's no facts about a car that are not equally accessible to any competent observer. But there are facts about subjects and agents that are only accessible to the agent. And if you've got a philosophy of science and a theory of reality that says that can't be, he wants to say, well, so much for your picture of reality. You're leaving something out. You need to sort of broaden the scope of your theory. These are the very data that we need to account for. There are certain facts about reality that are not equally accessible to any competent observer. That are only accessible from the first person. And your philosophical outlook and your scientific outlook, your scientific image of reality has to be able to accommodate that, or at least admit that those are facts before you can ever hope to explain them. And if you don't do that, any putative explanation you put forth is likely to fail.
He has a view where he dices up the ontological and the epistemic. Like he refers to epistemically subjective, ontologically subjective experiences that can be that have an epistemically objective quality. Like the cause, like he likes to break up ontologies and epistemics in terms of subjective and objective. And I actually quite liked that. I felt like that actually helps clarify some things. So he would say, like, see, certain pains that you feel are sharp. It's a ontologically subjective experience of the sharp pain, but that there are causal qualities that we can infer, and that those are epistemically objective facts that we can apprehend. So the delineation there is interesting. I don't know how you justify some of that, but I think it's helpful anyway.
Yeah, he's taken some heat from people like Dennett on the whole idea of something being ontologically subjective. He thinks, look, as soon as you start talking about subjective, objective, you're not talking ontology, you're talking epistemology. And so when you say, so someone like Dennett would deny Searle's claim that there are certain facts about you that are in principle only accessible to you as a subject. It's just a contingent fact that you happen to be hooked up to your brain, and I'm not hooked up to your brain. But if we were to hook up my brain to your hand and stab you in the hand, by God, we'd both be feeling that pain, right? And suddenly we've sort of, we've crossed that boundary.
You have V.S. Ramachandran saying that with mirror neurons that we experience each other's pain.
Yeah, well, I think that's a stretch there. Yeah. But Helen, I gotta run in a bit, but
yeah, I was just about to close out. Did you want to say something?
Well, you had a question for me about property dualism. Why isn't Searle a property dualist? Right.
Yeah, it's not really related to the Chinese room, but yeah, it sure does look, even though he claims he isn't, like maybe he really is, and just doesn't want to say he is.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
struggle with that. I go back and forth. Sometimes I understand what he's saying, but other times I don't. Like he talks about, I don't know, you can reduce, I guess he talks about like solidity, right? That you don't want to say that just because when we reduce solidity down to the molecular level, we are really reducing it down to the molecular level. We really say solidity is the motion of the molecules. But we don't do that. We can't do that when we talk about things like consciousness. And it sounds to me like he's saying we can't do that because we want that language, right? Because the thing about it is that it is specifically about what's going on inside of you. And so you can't ever ontologically reduce it. You can only causally reduce it. But then that really does seem like it seems to imply a little bit that he's got sort of two things. That it's not really true that he really is trying to say that it's just a state of the brain. It seems like he kind of goes back and forth a little bit. I'm hoping that you can clarify that.
Okay. Okay. Let me say something about what property dualism is as opposed to substance dualism. Okay. Descartes was a substance dualist. Okay, he believed that there was physical stuff like our bodies, and physical things had extension. They were res extensa. But then there was another kind of stuff, mental stuff, right? Your thoughts and feelings and all of that. Your whole of your mental life was a different kind of stuff. And the reason he thought it was a different kind of stuff, the reason he didn't think it was ultimately reducible to the physical, was that you can refer to to facts about the mental. Beliefs, desires, and hopes, and things like intentionality and subjectivity and all that stuff, consciousness. You can refer and pick out features of reality, mental features, without referring to where they are in space. They seem to take up no space. No space seems to. You don't seem to need the concept of space at all to refer to them. Where are your memories? Well, you'd say, oh, they're caused in your brain. Well, says you. Only because we've associated brain states with mental states, but where in your brain exactly is your memory? We don't. It's not. We don't have to associate mental states with the physical. And how much does a thought weigh? The question seems nonsensical even by modern standards, right? By our modern lights. So he thought that there was two kinds of stuff: mental stuff, res cogitans, and res extensa, the physical stuff. And then, of course, that view has sort of fallen on hard times. But there's this other view, property dualism, that says that, well, there are irreducibly two kinds of properties. Ultimately, there might be only one ontology, but there are two kinds of properties, and you can't reduce one kind of property to the other. So, for instance, you can't reduce the fact that our mental experiences are subjective, or you can't reduce the fact that some mental states are intentional. That is, they're about something. Right? You can't reduce that fact about reality, about certain mental experiences, to physical states in the brain, or any physical state, right? And so you have these, two kinds of properties. You have physical properties, and you have these other kinds of, somewhat spookier properties. Searle wants to say that there's no more reason to imagine that there's two kinds of properties than there is in the case of water and H2O molecules. Think of a glass of water. Let's say I have a glass of, full of water here. Okay. Now let's say that it's, you've got a liquid glass of water here. Okay. Or a glass of liquid water. Okay. Now, what's it composed of? Well, it's composed of H2O molecules. But now notice that the H2O molecules are not themselves wet. An individual H2O molecule isn't wet. I can't reach into a glass of water and say, here's an H2O molecule. Oh, this one's dry. Let me see if I can find a wet one. No, right? And liquidity isn't some extra juice or substance that's being squirted out by the H2O molecules. No, liquidity and the transparency of the water and all of that is just a higher level description of the state that the molecules are in at certain temperatures, and, right? And it's just how the molecules are colliding with each other, right? So liquidity is a higher level feature. It's a surface feature. It's a feature that's sort of available to our senses and stuff like that at a higher level of description. Okay, we can't see individual H2O molecules, right? But there are properties of water that are not properties of individual H2O molecules, but we don't say that the liquidity and transparency of the water is not a feature of the H2O molecules. It most certainly is a feature of the H2O molecules. It's just not a feature of any individual H2O molecule. It's a feature of the entire system of how the H2O molecules are interacting with each other. And he says, now, is there any property dualism there? No, we don't think that's property dualism. So he says, well, then why would you imagine that mental states and our mental idioms, when we talk about thoughts and feelings and beliefs and desires and all that, that higher level description of your lower level brain states, why would you think that there's any kind of property dualism there? These aren't different kinds of properties, right? It's just that we don't have a properly exhaustive account of how to reduce yet mental states to the physical states, just in a way that we have done with water, right? But he thinks, yeah, someday we will. So that's I think how he can how he would try to escape the charge.
But you don't think that's in very, very strong tension with his other claim that first-person, quote, ontology isn't reducible ontologically with third-person ontology? Because in the water and liquidity example, the reason why we don't say liquidity is epiphenomenal, the reason why there isn't some mysterious substance or tertium quid or some other type of sui generis property that liquidity is distinct from water molecules is because we do take it, in fact, to be ontologically reducible. That once you fix the microphysical facts on the level of H2O molecules in a given arrangement, you have liquidity. So it's in that sense that liquidity is nothing over and above, having a certain arrangement of H2O molecules.
Right.
But we literally reduce it. We literally reduce it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Right.
We have a causal reduction that boils right down to an ontological reduction of one to the other. Right. Ultimately, we could describe liquidity referring only to the behavior of H2O molecules. We would never have to say. We would never have to use those other idioms in terms of liquidity and so we wouldn't have to use that. But in the case of mental states, Searle wants to argue you're always going to need the subject. You're right that you're never going to be able epistemically from the third person to capture all of the relevant facts. So yeah, I agree, Pisha, that there is that tension there, and I've never been able to make sense of that analogy.
But I think that's why people accuse him of being a property dualist, right? Because take a property dualist. Well, he's not always a property dualist, but like Chalmers, right?
Mm-hmm.
Chalmers, he agrees with Searle that consciousness or phenomenal states are not ontologically reducible to microphysical states, let's say, right? But he agrees that at least on the level of natural necessity, phenomenal states are, quote, causally reducible to microphysical states because, at least with the force of natural necessity, any world that obeys natural laws, and in this case including certain psychophysical laws that are connecting microphysics to phenomenal states, anything that is a physical duplicate simplicator will also be a phenomenal duplicate. So if I duplicated your brain, you would have consciousness, but that's not because consciousness itself is somehow some physical property like liquidity. It's just that there are these psychophysical laws on the level of at least natural necessity such that when you have a physical duplicate, you also have a phenomenal duplicate. But it's because of the fact that we're not ontologically reducing it that there can be, let's say, possible worlds where you could have a physical duplicate without also duplicating consciousness.
Right.
So that's why I think where I see the charge that Searle's a property dualist coming from, because what is he really saying that's distinguishing himself from a property dualist? Like he calls himself a biological naturalist, but when we look at the commitments of his position, it doesn't seem to be any different than what the property dualists themselves are saying.
Yeah, I agree. It's a problem I've never understood. I mean, and I don't know how he can get around it, and I've never heard or read anything of his where he actually is able to distinguish himself in that way as not a property dualist.
I just wanted to. Sorry, go ahead. Oh, were you done speaking?
I was done.
Oh, okay. Well, what I just wanted to do was I wanted to connect that with the whole Chinese room thought experiment, which was just, like I think you said previously that Searle, when he's attacking strong AI, he's sort of indirectly attacking, the computational theory of mind and all that. And he's doing that on the base, and when he's doing that, where a lot of his critics are coming from is that they're not seeing him offering an alternative account that can actually explain why, say, brains cause minds, right? Because everybody accepts brains cause minds. Property dualists, even substance dualists, accept that brains cause minds in some sense, right?
Mhm.
That's sort of a given, right? And he's not offering an alternative account. He's just saying a system that has, quote, the right causal powers will generate mentality. But that sort of begs the question as to what are the right causal powers.
Right.
Let's say take an instantiation of your web browser right now, right? Firefox, Opera, Internet Explorer, whatever, right? You could imagine that we could systematically replace the hardware that's generating the software with some other operating system or some other hardware. We wouldn't affect you being able to use your browser currently as it is right now. So in some sense, the right causal powers to give rise to your browser are not strictly tied to the specific substrate that is producing your browser, but to a specific set of operations done by that hardware. So you might say then, well, then in that case, the right causal powers just are formal syntactical computations, which is independent of a given substrate. So then, when he says that it has to have the right causal powers, what I think the strong AI proponent is going to argue is, then, well, what are the right causal powers? They might just be formal syntactical manipulation. And if you say that, well, that can never give rise to semantics, and at the same time, you don't give us a positive account of as to how the brain causes mentality, it just seems to just be an obscure claim. Because I mean, because what are brains doing fundamentally that's going to be different than molecules colliding with each other? Something that it's just some type of it is in some sense a purely syntactical process as well, right? There's no semantics on the level of individual neurons, and it's sort of hard to see how you could get semantics with just more neurons doing what they're doing.
Right. Well, Searle's answer to that, I think, would be this. In the case of brains, we have every reason to think that brains cause minds. Okay, we just, we're made of brains, and we think so. And there's all the evidence that we could possibly need in the form of correlations between mental states and brain states. And if you tinker with my brain, you tinker with my mental states, and for every mental state that's going on in my brain, there's some neural correlate in my brain, and so forth. So he thinks, look, we prima facie, brains cause minds. Okay, but what specifically the causal powers are, he doesn't pretend to know. Okay, but what he's trying to argue is that the strong AI thesis is making a very strong claim, and that's what strong AI, that formal symbol manipulation isn't just able to simulate mental states, it's constitutive of mental states. If you have the right program with the right input-output functions, then that would literally be creating cognition in that computer, because that's all there is to having it. And Searle's saying, well, wait a minute, I don't see how this works. Exactly how does this work, other than, oh, well, it walks like a duck, it talks like a duck, therefore it's a duck. Well, wait a minute, that doesn't settle the question at all. And he has a thought experiment that he goes, let's imagine that Martians land, okay, on our planet, okay, and we open up their spaceships and we see there's something inside there, but they don't look like organisms, but they don't look like robots either. Maybe they look like some kind of mechanical insect or something like that. And we open up what we think are their heads, and there's like coconut custard inside. I mean, does that settle the question? I mean, did they send their robots, or did they send themselves? Did they come here and they're thinking, or did they just send inanimate robots that are so cleverly crafted that they look to us like they enjoy mental life, but they don't? It doesn't settle the question, right? We don't know. I mean, if they were made like us, out of the same kind of stuff as us, we could infer by induction, yeah, okay, they're made like us, and we know that we have minds, therefore they probably have minds too, and it would probably be a safe bet, right? And he says, you can imagine thought experiments. Like, you can imagine a thought experiment where, let's say that systems from Mars, land, and we want to know, are the Martians conscious, or are these robots that were sent and they're just mindless? The lights aren't on. They're just sort of mindless automata doing complicated pre-programmed tasks. Okay, and so we decide, hey, look, they have something in their head that, let's say they look vaguely humanoid, and we open up their heads and we look inside. Oh my God, it looks like Intel inside there. It's all microchips. Okay, so we open up the Martian's head and we look inside and we pull out microchips and we say, hey, these look like they're relevant in, or we study them and we discover, hey, these are relevant in visual perception for them, and these are relevant in bodily motion, stuff like that. And so he says you could run an experiment. You could literally like open up my skull, open up its skull, rip out parts of my brain, and insert parts of my brain, of its brain into my brain. You could like plug in, Martian microchips into our brain. Okay, hypothetically. Okay, let's say that we do something like that. Okay, now there's a lot of ways that this could go. One way that this could go is you rip out a piece of my my brain. Let's say you rip out my visual cortex, okay, and you insert, what we think is the analogous visual cortex of the Martian robot or alien. Put that in my brain. A couple of things could happen. One thing that could happen is I go blind. I go, holy hell, I can't see. Please, restore my visual cortex. I can't see. And then you do it again. You rip out, my auditory cortex, and you go in. I can't. I'm deaf. Help! And my mental life could just shrink, right? At some point, you might rip out a part of me, and then suddenly I feel that I've lost physical sensation, and that I can't move my body anymore. Okay. Then you might reverse the process, and you might, plug in all of those, take all those Martian bits out, put my brain back, right? Restore my brain bit by bit, and I feel my body come back to life. I feel physical sensations. I can move again. My hearing comes back. My vision comes back. Right? My ability to recall, direct my own thoughts comes back. Everything comes back. And I go, whew, man! When you ripped out my brain and started, putting in those Martian microchips, I was gone. Right? Now, according to Searle, that would be a first-person test of whether or not whether those things think. Okay? Because and he says it's an empirical test because in principle, it could have gone the other way. They could have ripped out my visual cortex, put in the visual analog of the Martians architecture into my brain. And I might say, hey, I can still see, right? And you might say, well, wait a minute, Ozzy, how do we know you're actually still seeing and not just saying you can see? Well, you can restore my brain afterwards, and I can say, oh yeah, I had an uninterrupted stream of consciousness. I wasn't just passing the Turing test mindlessly while I had a Martian brain in there bit by bit. I remember everything. It all went. It was all great. It was all a seamless, consciousness, right? So according to Searle, the ability to test whether another system, right? How would we know for some other system whether it was conscious and had mental life and all that? That is actually an empirical claim that is testable. It's just it's not testable by the Turing test. You can't just look at the behavior. The answer to that question has to be done epistemologically from the first person. You have to ask the subject. And unfortunately, with the Chinese room, you can't ask the subject, right?
That sounds very similar to Chalmers' fading qualia argument, although he takes the opposite conclusion.
Well, there's a counter argument. Like someone like Dennett and others would argue, no, Searle, you can't do what you're doing. You can't. Your test is actually inconclusive, Searle. If we rip out bits of your brain and we put in Martian microchips into your brain, yes, you might find that your mental life is shrinking, right? Your visual field disappears, your auditory experiences and the ability to control your body disappear, and all of that goes, right? You can't remember, you can't direct your thoughts. You are effectively dying mentally, bit by bit, as we replace your brain with microchips. And then we restore you, and you feel yourself coming back, right? And then you would say, well, Ozzy, how was it? And I'd say, oh, it was awful. You were killing me bit by bit. You were just destroying my mental life, right? So therefore, those chips don't work. They don't produce a mental life. But someone like Dennett or a teleofunctionalist would say, whoa, not so fast. You died, Ozzy. Your mental life was destroyed, eradicated bit by bit. But there was a new mind coming in there. It just wasn't your mind. It just wasn't you, right? So even that, Searle, that doesn't settle the question. So what you think, Searle, is an empirical test wouldn't actually solve it, because on the first-person criterion, you still wouldn't know, right?
Right.
It's actually quite complicated. I don't know what Chalmers says on that. Is that his answer to that?
Well, Chalmers, in the conscious mind, he has like three arguments: absent qualia, dancing qualia, and fading qualia. I mean, like back then he was a type of dualist. I think he's more of a panpsychist these days. But even though he was a dualist, he did support a type of functionalism, because he thought, at least on the level of natural necessity, once you sort of fixed sort of a given causal architecture, regardless of the substrate, it would duplicate phenomenal field. So, if you had a silicon version of your brain, you would more or less have the same phenomenal states. And one of the arguments he used to try to support that is, like, imagine if you replaced neuron by neuron, you replace it with silicon chips. And the thought experiment was, either it's going to be the case that, like you were saying, your consciousness would slowly fade away to nothingness, or it would continue uninterrupted. And he wanted to suggest that it would continue on uninterrupted. So at least on the level of natural necessity, we might say one of the psychophysical laws would be, what actually matters to consciousness is a certain type of functional / structural architecture, not specifically the substrate, namely, organic or silicon-based or something else that it's actually made out of. But in that test that you mentioned, though, like with the first person perspective, you wanted to say that was Searle's way of sort of answering that question, right?
Yeah, I think that's how you would go with that. Yeah.
But I mean, isn't that sort of begging the question as to,
Yes.
like, when you're giving all these verbal reports, right? Those verbal reports are being interpreted by somebody that's not you.
Right.
And science as a whole is, it's going to be based off of those. Sorry.
Right.
Go ahead.
No, but the core of the appeal is going to be the subject. But that's why you have to be restored. For Searle, this is only going to work if you can be restored, and then you can report afterwards a seamless continuity of experiences, or you can report, wow, I disappeared there for a while, bit by bit, until I was all gone, and then I felt myself coming back. Right. That's the only person whose testimony matters, and so you can't ask the person during the procedure. You have to ask after you've restored the person from that procedure. So what was it like? That's the only verdict that will matter for him.
Right. I mean, I understand that, but I'm just saying that, I mean, to some extent, I think this sort of broaches on the other minds issue, doesn't it? Like, in terms of, I mean, I'm not accessing your mind directly. I'm not accessing anybody's mind directly in the Hangout.
Mm-hmm.
But you're producing sound waves, which I'm interpreting according to some language as having some meaning, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, given what Searle was saying, just the ability to produce, engage in this behavior is not itself sufficient to actually have mentality, right? Because a computer, he's not denying a computer could simulate all of that, right? And perhaps not actually being conscious. So, I mean, there seems to be a certain puzzle there, in that all we sort of have to go on just is behavior in a certain sense.
Yeah. Well, he's not trying to solve the other mind's problem, really, right? I mean, I think he would grant that the other mind's problem is, strictly speaking, insoluble. We don't know. I mean, solipsism is a possibility. Well, there are certain arguments against solipsism, of course, but he's not trying to solve that problem.
Not just solipsism per se. I mean, just the hypothesis that all of you guys are just pea zombies, or that I'm on the equivalent of the Truman Show, and all of you guys are just really cleverly disguised automata. Not that the external world doesn't exist, but that the external world is not what I thought it was.
Okay, but even philosophical zombies, he's not trying to solve that problem, right? His view is that you don't have to solve the problem of philosophical zombies to solve this problem, right? And I actually think he's right about that. I think those are quite separate problems, right? It's not that. What he's trying to point out is that.
No, I think I understand the gist of it. Like, the idea is that because we have this first-person ontology, and the investigation can only ever be done within the first person, ultimately, to begin with, right? That's sort of the idea, isn't it?
Right, and
you're talking about when you have to restore them and then take their verbal reports. So you're taking them as an authority of some sort as to what happened.
That's right, and that no account given by strong AI is actually a satisfactory account, because it doesn't actually tell you at what point semantics comes in. All it can ever tell you is that at some point the behavior is such that it's indistinguishable from a critter with semantics, right? But his part of his point is, well, yeah, but that doesn't settle anything, right? And if it weren't for the fact that we have mental lives and we have brains and we have every reason to think that our brains cause our mental life, we wouldn't think that brains could cause minds either, right? It's a contingent fact that we have come to the conclusion that brains cause minds, right? I mean, if this skull was impregnable, if we had no way into it, right, we would not have associated a mental life with the oatmeal texture stuff between our ears. Right? I mean, Aristotle didn't know that the brain was for thinking. He thought it was a radiator that cooled the blood. I mean, people just associated mental life with other parts of your body, with your stomach, with your heart, with your liver, with your spleen, and things like that. I mean, people associated your mental life and your mental states and your emotional states with things going on in your body because, I mean, it took a while before people sort of pieced together that this thing between your ears is actually what's relevant to your mental life. So it's not at all obvious. So it's a contingent fact of history that we associate these things. And as Searle sees it, well, okay, yeah, but fortunately we have that fact now. That's under our belts. We can run with that, right? But when it comes to aliens,
what I'm trying to say, I guess, is we're sort of bracketing the other minds issue with respect to other humans. They're
right,
like Searle is.
Right.
But I mean, isn't there sort of an other minds issue potentially with a non-human entities that could potentially have consciousness, like his example with the Martians, or even with artifacts?
Yeah, I mean,
when we're saying that, when we're doing this test with the Turing test or whatever, we're not taking that to be sufficient to say for in fact that person has or that entity has a mental life. All we can really have to begin with, because seeing as we're not in fact AI or a Martian or whatever, all we can really appeal to there just is their behavior. And in the case of humans, all we can really do is just appeal to some type of analogy, like saying, well, I'm composed of this kind of stuff and I have consciousness. Other people are also composed of this kind of stuff, so they probably also have consciousness, right? But ultimately, we're always only operating off of behavior, since we can't, like you're saying, delve into their mind in some fashion.
Yeah, but he doesn't think it's just behavior at that coarse level. As he sees it, it's how the behavior fits the structure of the organism in the right way, and that's why we're all quite confident, most of us anyway, that that your chess-playing computer isn't thinking about chess, isn't wanting to now why not? Well, it's because it's behavior. I mean, it sort of looks like it could be a thing. Well, no, is it though? Well, no, actually, it doesn't have the right kinds of motivations and things like that. There's something that's missing, and it isn't a brain that's missing, right? I mean, supposing we built a brain out of neurons and that could play chess, then it would be a real open question. Wow, maybe this thing is really thinking about chess, right? But so as Searle sees it, yes, of course, we are bracketing the other mind's problem, and we're able to do that because we just contingently are fortunate enough to know enough about brains that they are correlated with mental states, and so we can just press on. But as soon as you're talking about a different kind of architecture, we don't know, and that's not a kind of chauvinism, right? That's not being speciesist. There's no chauvinism going on. It's really an open question, right? And I mean, what? I mean, if you really just want to sort of apply the Turing test, why don't we think that your chess-playing computer is trying to beat you and literally willing to sacrifice a pawn in order to get a rook or something like that in order to obtain a better position, because its ultimate goal is to put you into checkmate? Why don't we think that, right? Is that just chauvinism, right? Now, and I mean, there are people on the other side who would say, yeah, it is. I mean, someone like John McCarthy will say, yeah, if any system that can sort of behave in any way that emulates what we can do with our minds, or what an organism can do with its mind, has got a mind. I mean, John McCarthy is sort of famous for saying that my thermostat has three thoughts: it's too hot in here, it's too cold in here, it's just right in here.
Yeah.
And he's not,
No, I understand that, but maybe there's another perspective. 'Cause I'm just trying to think about from the perspective of somebody who was, say, in favor of a strong AI, how they could maybe think through this. Let's say instead, like, because Searle's test is with privileging this first-person ontology, because if you're not talking in terms of first-person ontology, you're changing the subject in some way.
Yeah.
Let's say they came at it from a different angle. Suppose that they proposed a theory where they set out certain general principles, ones that were not, say, anthropocentric in any fashion, ones that could potentially apply to any system whatsoever as far as what is determinative or constitutive of consciousness. And I'm thinking of something like integrated information theory or the like, those kinds of theories. And what they would do is they would use humans as a test case. Like, our theory generates these predictions. Let's see if it plays out with humans, because again, we're acknowledging that humans are obviously conscious, right? So if our theory, which again operates on this very generalized level, that's not specific to humans at all, but certainly makes predictions about human consciousness, then we can test those with respect to human consciousness. And to that extent, we could say that confirms the theory we have as to what, is constitutive of consciousness. And if we find other entities that are non-humans that satisfy the principles of those theories, then we can likewise infer that they too have consciousness. Would Searle have a problem with that kind of approach?
I honestly don't know. What do you say about that?
Like maybe I can just briefly explain the example that I was using. Like, I don't know, are you familiar with integrated information theory at all? Or
Yeah, I have some idea of it, but the
okay.
Okay, well, I know he doesn't like information theoretical approaches.
He actually wrote a reply to a Koch and Tononi about integrated information theory. He wasn't a fan of it.
Yeah, I know he's not, but I didn't read that. What did he say about it?
I can't remember exactly, but I think he was accusing them of confusing like information for like explaining consciousness or something. But I was always interpreting Tononi as like offering a proposal as to at least what something like what the psychophysical laws could be, and then using humans as a test case to confirm the theory.
Mm-hmm.
Because the two postulates are, whatever is the local maximum of integrated information is conscious, and then and he has a specific way of quantifying, like, in some sense, how conscious something is, and then that generates certain predictions about both the behavior and what self-reports people should have under specific circumstances. And the idea is that if we could test it in humans, then we would have a good reason to think that this applies in general, not just to human neurology, but even things made of other sorts of substrates. And then to that extent, whatever satisfies the principles of integrated information theory, we could then likewise infer is also conscious as well. You're just sort of using humans as a way to confirm the theory, because given that we're humans and we have access to our own first-person phenomenal states, we're using ourselves as a test case to confirm the theory.
Yeah, well, I don't. You know more about what he said there than I do, because I haven't read that at all. So I have no clue. I know that. Go ahead. Hello, am I frozen?
No, you're still there. I was just going to try to look up the article for you.
Okay.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I have to get going actually. So and